In this video, we will talk about how to use Passport with Node.js. So what is Passport? Passport is a very powerful and popular authentication middleware for Node.js. It is extremely flexible and modular. That is, Passport can be used in any Express-based web application. And one of the most interesting, important features of Passport is that it supports a comprehensive set of authentication strategies, including username, password, cookies, JSONWebTokens, OAuth, Google, Facebook, Twitter, etc. So typically in your applications, when you develop web applications, you would have seen different kinds of authentication models. So as a customer or as a user, you might get login with Google, login with Facebook, login with Twitter. You might get a login based on a form, username, password, and the underlines could be cookies, JWT, OAuths. So all these strategies are supported by Passport, which is why it is a very popular and highly used and recommended authentication middleware for Node.js. So how do we use Passport in Node.js? The first step is to install the module for Passport. So that is npm install Passport. And then depending upon the authentication strategy that you're using, you will need to install that module. So in this video, we will talk about three authentication strategies: local, cookie, and JWT. So you need to install the npm packages for them: npm install passport local, npm install passport cookie, and npm install passport JWT. In fact, if you go to the Passport website, you can see that it supports a lot of strategies. So Facebook, Google, OAuth, Twitter, and you can go ahead and kind of read about them here. So suppose we are going to use Passport JWT. So a Passport strategy for authenticating with a JSON web token, and it gives us the details, the npm install, and the usage. So that's how Passport has all these strategies that it supports. As we discussed in this video, we will talk about three: local, cookie, and JWT. So go ahead and install Passport, and then Passport local, Passport cookie, and Passport JWT. So let us see how do we use Passport with our first strategy, which is local strategy. So in our local strategy, in our get request, we will get the username and password in the body. So that is what the local strategy means. So what does this say? Authenticate get requests using the username and password provided in the body. Test it for post/user. In the post, we are not using authentication based on Passport. The get requests, the get/user and the get/my orders will be authenticated using Passport. So let's go to our VS Code. And in our VS Code, we have a standard boilerplate Express app. And let's start writing our code here. So first, let's define all our requires. So the first is let passport equal to require passport. Next, we need to handle our local strategy. So local strategy is equal to require. We had installed passport local for our local strategy dot strategy. What we have also defined is this data2.js, which has users with the fields ID, name, password, and role. And then we have orders, which are orders placed by these users, which have been exported. So users and orders have been exported, which is what we will use. So let's do require on them. Users comma orders is equal to require data. So once we have done our requires, let's do a app of dot use passport dot initialize. So we have integrated now passport into the middleware. App.use will put it in the middleware. So we are using passport here. Next, we need to define our strategy. So let's define let strategy is equal to new local strategy. So the local strategy is what we had gotten from the require. And this takes a function as parameter, which has three fields: username, password, which we get for authentication, and a function done, which we will call based on the authentication, whether we succeed or fail. How do we use it? Let's look at that. Let's first log, just do a log in local strategy, and we have received this username and password. Let's validate the user. So let user is equal to users dot find u such that u dot name is equal to username and u dot password is equal to password. So standard, we will do a find. Let's also log the console dot log user comma user. Now, if we did not find a user, it means the authentication failed. So we will call done with these parameters, and we will just do a return done. The first parameter is null. That is typically for errors. Here the authentication has failed, so we are returning a false. And we can provide a message: incorrect username or password. Else, if our authentication succeeded, what we will do? Return done null comma user. So this is the user we got from authentication. So we are calling done with that user. In the earlier case, we called done with a false. So the user was not there. Once we have defined the strategy, we will configure the strategy in passport. So passport.use strategy. So we have configured our strategy. So what we are saying that any GET requests, this is the strategy passport is gonna use. Now we need to define our route. So app.post / user function request comma response. Let's get the username and password from the body. Again, we will need to check the same check that we did earlier. So let me copy that. If user, let's say we define something called, say, let payload is equal to ID, we define a JSON user.id and send it as a response. Else, what do we do? Else it's an error, response dot send status 401. We have gotten an error here. So that's our post. Notice in this post we have not used the passport authentication strategy in any manner. Next, let's define our get. So what are the gets we want to do? app.get / user. So that's our path. Next, like we did in route handlers, so let's define a route handler here, passport.authenticate. So we are asking passport to authenticate with say, because we don't want to use sessions, so session comma session is false. And then we have our standard function request comma response. So if passport will authenticate, what it will do, it will give us this user in the request. So if we have reached here, means we have the user in the request. So we can just say response.send request.user. So what authenticate would have done is put this user into the request. So we can just send it. Similarly, if we want to do app.get /my orders, again we want to authenticate passport.authenticate. We are not using sessions, so that is why we're just providing it as session is false, comma function request comma response. Now we've gotten the user, so we want all the orders of the user, so we can say let orders1 is equal to orders.filter or such that dot user id is equal to user.id and response.send orders1. So you could have a question, what if the user was not defined? If the user is not defined, typically passport would send back a 401 or a 403 error. We will not reach here. And we can see that by putting a console.log in get/user, and let's put the request.user. Similarly here, let's put that same thing in get/my orders. So now we have defined it. Let's run this app and let's go to our Postman and test it. So let's start with our post, local host, and we have this user. What is our body? It's a JSON. Username is, say, let's go and check what are the values we provided. Let's say we log in with George. If I send it, this is what we had sent in the response of the post. We get ID is 3. Now let's implement our get. Let's test our get. So in our get, what is the body? We will send this body because it expects this username password. So let's just send it. Typically we don't do that, but here we are doing it just for our testing purpose. And we have gotten an error. Let's go back and check. Unknown authentication strategy. So what we would have done, so what's the error here is that when we are calling it, we need to give it the strategy name, which in this case is local. So the default strategy name for local is local. So we should have provided that. That's the error. So don't make this error. Let's restart it. Now when I send it, I get back the user. And if we go here and see, we get in local strategy with this username password. This is the user we got in our passport in the local strategy function. This is the strategy function that we defined. And then in get/user, this is the user. So this user had been put by passport into the request. Let's test it for the other one, which is my orders. Let's first send it without the body. We get a bad request. So we get a 401 bad request, which the server has sent us. So passport failed the authentication, and this is what we got. Let's send this JSON and let's me make an error in the password. So we get unauthorized. So because the password was wrong, now let me correct the password, and we have gotten an error. Let's see why. User is not defined. So we are getting an error at line 54. So this should have been request.user.id. So that's the error. So always read the error messages, the line numbers, they help us fix them. Let's go ahead and send this again. And we have gotten all the orders for George. Let's test it for some other user. So let's test it for John. We get the orders for John, which is user ID 1. And if we check our, so in local strategy with the username and password, this is the user we got in the local strategy. And in the get, this is the user we have received. So this is our request.user. So once the authentication was successful in password, it put this user into our request, and the way we will access it is with this username. So request.user. This could have been anything else, but this is how we will put it, request.user. So I could have also made this, let's say, user1. Again, it will still remain request.user. So remember that that's not the name. If I send it, we are getting an error. Why? This should have been user1. Let's run it again. So we get that. So notice the name, the specific name that the passport is putting it is request.user. In the request, it's putting this JSON object named user. So this is how we have used this authentication strategy. And what's the advantage of using this? That all we need to do in every get that we want to authenticate, we will just call this authenticate. And then we keep on writing our functions as it is. So you can just drop this. And if you want to change the authentication strategy, just make any change here. This will continue to work as it is. So that's the advantage of using passport. Next, what do we want to do? Extend the previous app to define two authentication strategies. First one for role as customer and second one for role as admin. Post/user will work as it is because it's not getting authenticated through passport. Get/user, get/my orders will work for any valid user, and get/all orders will work only for admin role. So what we will do is define two strategies and see how to use them. So let's call this strategy all, and we will call this name as a role all. So everybody is getting validated in this strategy all. And notice we have given a name here. So earlier we had not given a name, it had defaulted to local. We have given a name so that we will identify it and we will see like that. And let's also define a say strategy. Let's call it admin. So this will work only for admin. And here what we will check is else if user.role is not equal to admin. That is the way admin is defined. So it's user.role. So if it is not admin, then also what we will do, return done with a null comma false, because this is only for admin. And we can provide say a message if we want. you do not have admin role, else we return this user. So we have done another level of authentication here, another level here wherein we are testing for the role. And let's define this, configure this also here and call it, say, role admin. And what's the name of this functions? Variable strategy admin. So we have now defined two roles. Now how do we go ahead and use them? So here in the user, we want all the users. So let's say all the roles, we will call this role all. That is how we want to authenticate it. My orders is also role all. And which was the request for? All orders is only with admin role. So let's implement all orders. So app.get all orders passport.authenticate. What's the authentication? Role admin. This role is only for admin, so we will just provide role admin. Session is false, comma function request comma response. So now what do we do here? Let's just put a console.log in get all orders. And what do we need to send? We just need to send all the orders. So I will just send orders. So, and this should have been all orders. So here what we are saying that the authentication role is role admin. And what does role admin mean? Role admin means this is the strategy admin that we had defined. So this is the strategy admin. What it tests is not only whether the user is present, but whether the role is admin or not. So now if we want to come to all orders with a role which is not admin, we should get an error. So let's test it out. So let's first run the same things earlier. So this is working fine, the John. The George piece is also running fine, and this is also working fine. Let's define the all orders get request. Let's send it. We got a bad request. Now let me send John. We got an error here. Why did we get an error? Let's test it. User is not defined. 35. So this should have been user1, the change we had made. So that's the error. Let's test it again. And we get a unauthorized. Why? Because this user was unauthorized. The request was fine. A bad request meant that the username password had not been provided, but this guy is unauthorized. If I make an error and send it, we just get an unauthorized. Let's look for an admin role. So what an admin role is? Tim. Let's send those credentials. And you can see we have gotten all the orders. If we go and look at our in local strategy, so we are in this local strategy, we can just say local strategy admin or local strategy all. We got that user, and in get all orders we got this user and we sent all of it. The other should also work fine if I give Tim, because here again we are getting the user, but why did we get an empty array? Let's check. What's the user ID? 5. There are no orders pertaining to Tim. So this is working fine. So again, if we recap, here we defined two strategies. And depending upon how we wanted to use it, we defined them. We configured them by giving them a name. So we called one as role all, and the other as role admin. And then in our get request, we are just defining the role with which we want to authenticate. Earlier, we had put it as local, which is the generic name for the local strategy. And now we have specified the name. So it's always better to use a name here and use it, which is the way we did it. And we can keep on defining as many strategies as we want, depending upon what is the requirement for that get request, and keep on configuring it here. Next, what do we want to do? Modify the previous application to use cookie as the authentication strategy instead of local. In the post/user on successful authentication, set a cookie. So we will set a cookie in the post once the user is successfully authenticated in the post, and that's happening outside passport, as you remember. And then that cookie should work normally as part of our cookie strategy. So let's see how do we do that. So here we are creating another, say, passport cookie.js, and it has the boilerplate code, standard boilerplate code. Let's see what are the steps we will need to do. Some we will use from our passport local and some we will change. So we will be able to understand the changes that are happening, and that should highlight things better for us. So let's first look at our requires. Let me copy them and put them here. Now, what is the change here? So instead of passport local, we had installed passport cookie, and let's call it, say, cookie strategy. So that's our first change. Next, what did we do? We did app.passinitialize, which we will do here also. But because we are using cookies, we will need to do another cookie parser we will need to use for our, so require cookie parser, and we will need to configure it into our middleware. So we have configured our cookie parser also. Note, we should put it above our passport.initialize so that the cookie parser is first called and then the passport.initialize is called. Next, what do we need to do? Let's go and get our strategy functions. So we had the strategy function strategy all. Let's copy that and let's see what would be the modification. So this would be new cookie strategy. And what are the parameters that the cookie strategy takes? So cookie strategy here, we will define the name of our cookie. So let's define here const my cookie, which is the name of our cookie, and let's call it, say, passport cookie. So cookie name is my cookie. And next we need to pass it this function. It takes the token from the cookie and done. So it's taking two parameters. So why is it taking two parameters? So this token will be the value from the cookie. So let's make it in cookie strategy and let's put the token in. Now, how do we validate it? Suppose in the cookie we had sent the ID of the user. This is what we are doing in our post. In the post, that's what we have done. So we have sent the ID of the user. So now that we have the ID of the user, we can find the user1 is equal to users.find u such that u.id is equal to token.id. So we had sent this JSON in which we had sent the ID as a field ID, and we have gotten the user. Once we have gotten the user, the rest should work exactly the same way. So if we did not find the user, we will run an error message if there was a problem in the token user. If it did not find the token, Passport would handle it on its own, and otherwise we have received it. So this is our strategy all. Similarly, let us define our strategy admin. So let me copy this. Strategy admin will be the same thing, except that we will put that same condition here, else if user one dot role not equal to admin, then we will return null, false, and what was the message? Let's just copy that message also. You do not have admin role, so that we make it identical. So we have defined our strategy admin and our strategy all. Next, what do we need to do? We need to configure these roles. So let's configure it. Let's name them the same. So we have role all and role admin. Next, what did we need to define? We had put in our post. So let's copy our post. Now in the post, there will be a change that instead of sending this as a payload, we will set a cookie. So response dot cookie. What is the name of the cookie? My cookie. And what is its value? Its value will be, say, this payload. So let's define this below it. And we can say login success. So that's the change. We need to use cookies. So we have sent a cookie. Next, what do we need to define? Our gets. So let's copy our 3 gets. Now, do we need to make any change in our get? Let's look at our first. It will authenticate with the passport, with the role all. We defined role all here, which was strategy all. And it will get the users and this will work. So now you can understand the power of it. My get requests are just not changing. Although I've changed my strategy to a cookie, in the post, I need to make a very slight change to handle the cookie. Rest, I am not making any change. I only changed my strategies. So these are the functions I changed, but I don't need to make any other change. So let's now go ahead and test it. So we will call passport cookie. Now let me call this post login success. And you can see we have gotten this cookie. Once we have gotten this cookie, let me go to a get, and now I don't need this object in a get. There is no object being sent. See, I have gotten back the details for George. Did we log in with George? Yes. So we got the cookie. So if we see here in cookie strategy all, we get the ID is 3, which is the cookie. From there, we have put the user, and in the get user, we get the user. If I'll delete this again. If I get all my orders, so for what is George's ID 3? For the user ID 3, we have gotten all the orders. And now if we get an unauthorized because George is not an admin. Let's change it to somebody else. Let's say change it to John. And now if I send it, the cookie would have changed. If I go to cookies and see it, so the cookie would have changed. And now if I go to get, see, we are getting John, which is perfectly fine. We're getting all the orders for user ID 1. And we're still getting an unauthorized because this is not a admin. Let's make it an admin, which is Tim. Let's log in. So we have gotten a login success. So we have gotten the details for Tim. The role is admin. There should be no orders for Tim. And now when I go to the get request and talk about it, we get all the orders. This is exactly what we wanted. So now this is something we have implemented with the cookie strategy. Next, what do we want to do? Passport with JWT or JSON Web Tokens as a strategy. Modify the previous application to use JSON Web Tokens or JWT as the authentication strategy instead of cookie. In the post/user on successful authentication, send the JWT token as response. Instead of sending the cookie that we did earlier, setting the cookie, we will now send the token as the response. And the token will be sent in the field named authorization in the header and will start with the keyword bearer. So this is one of the most common ways of authentication that we use. So the header, the authorization field in the header has this with a bearer starting with the keyword bearer. So all the GET requests will have this. So let's go ahead and do that. So just like we did for passport cookie, let's go to JWT, which is a standard code. Now let's make those changes. So what all do we need as required? So we will need our passport JWT and let's call it JWT strategy. Next, what do we need in the case of JWT? We also need something known as let extract JWT equal to require passport JWT dot extract JWT. So the purpose of this extract JWT is that we can extract the JSON Web Token from different places. It can come in a cookie, it can come in the body, it can come as a parameter, as a query string parameter, it can come in the authorization header. Here we are going to use the authorization header, which is the most common typical use case. So which is why we need this extract JWT. We don't need the cookie parser, so we are done here. Next, what do we need to do? We need to configure them. So let's put it. Do we need to use the cookie parser? No, we don't need to use the cookie parser. So let me remove that. So we have initialized our passport. Next, we need to define our strategy. So let's copy this strategy code for strategy all and put it here. Now, what are the changes we need here? So this will be new JWT strategy. Now, what are the parameters it takes? It takes a params, a variable, and a function, token comma done. And what do we do here? In JWT strategy all token. Now we need to get from the token rest of the stuff. So the token is exactly what we got earlier. And this should work. So the token would be the token we had put in. Now we need to specify in the params. So what in the params it expects is some of the configurations that we should have given. So let's define it. Const params is equal to JWT from request is extract JWT dot from bearer token. So what does this mean? This means that we are specifying that the token would be in the authorization header as a bearer token. So JWT has multiple kinds of pieces here. So if we go to the JWT passport usage and start reading it, extracting JWT from the extractor, there are multiple extractors built in. So that is what we are specifying. We are using the from authorization header as bearer token. It could be from header, from body field. So these are all kind of extractors built in wherein that token could be specified. So here in the parameters we are specifying where the JWT should be extracted from, and we need to specify the secret or key, which is basically the JWT secret, which is what JWT uses. So we need to specify that secret key. And the other parameter typically we associate with JWT is our expiry seconds. So let's define that. We will need to use it somewhere. So let's define it as say 30 seconds. So now that we have defined the secret key and this, the JWT will be able to utilize it and send. So here in our token, we will just get the token that we had put in. Where would we have put in the token? Like in the cookie, we put it in our post. Same thing we would have done it here. We would have put in our post, which would now come in the authorization header. Let's configure the other two parts also first, and then we will come to our post. So we need our strategy admin is new JWT strategy. It takes params. And rest is the same. Our passport.use will also be the same. There should be no change there. Next, what do we need to come to? Let's come to our post. In the post, we will need to create the JWT token and send it. So here we will need to create our post. Payload is this. So let token equal to, we will need to do a JWT.sign. If you have not seen the JWT video where we talked about JSON web tokens, do see that, because that will help understand this. So the payload, the key, which is our params.secret of key, so the same key, and then we need to provide it with the algorithm, which is HS256, and the expires in, which is what have we defined it as, JWT expiry seconds. So these are our parameters. Once we have gotten the token, we will not send the cookie here. Let's just send the token as say a JSON token is bearer plus token. The only reason we are sending it like this is because this is exactly how we want it in the header. So we are sending it as a JSON. This is the string that will get constructed, is what we need to send in the header as an authorization. So this is our post. Once we have done our post, let's implement our get. And notice here, like in the previous case, there is no change in the get. It will get authenticated. If the authentication fails, it will send back an error. Otherwise, we will get the user and we will continue to use it. So even in the get, there is no change. In the post, because we generated the token, there was a slight change, but in the get, there is no change at all. Let's test it. So passport JWT, let's run it. So now in our post, let's send, say again, George and George, and we get an error. Let's look at the error. JWT is not defined. So we did not do the require for that. Let JWT is equal to require JSON web token. We forgot to do that, which is why we got an error here. Let's start it again. So we have gotten this token. It's a bearer With this, there is an error here. We should have put in a space. That's the standard definition. So bearer, then a space, and then a token. That's the standard. So remember that. So we have put in this. So this is our bearer. Now let us go to our get request. If I send, now it gives me unauthorized. Why does it give us unauthorized? All the cookies are still present. Let me clear these cookies. The authorization we are using is JWT. So now if I send it again, we get unauthorized. So what do we do in our headers? Authorization. Now what is the value? This is the value from bearer. This is the whole value that we need to copy, and if I send that, I still get an unauthorized. So why are we getting an unauthorized? So probably the token has expired. We sent it as 30 seconds. So in that period, that token expired. Let's regenerate a new token. And if I send that token, let's see. We get George ID. This is fine. Let's go to again, we get an unauthorized. Let's increase the time. So if that is the issue, let's make it say 300. And let's start generating the tokens again. Did we restart the server? I don't think so. So let's generate the token. We have now gotten a token with 300 seconds. Now if I send it, we get all the orders for George. If I send the authorization here for all orders, we get an unauthorized because this user is not authorized. Let's try it with Tim. This is the token we get. Let us try it for all orders. And we get all the orders. So here we are using JWT as the authentication strategy. And what we are also saying that in our headers, we are putting it as bearer space and the token. So this is one of the most standard ways, and this module passport JWT supports it the way we implemented it, and this works perfectly fine. So let's just do a recap, because now we have seen three strategies. We saw local, we saw cookie, and we saw JWT. Why is passport so useful? So all we did was we defined some strategies and the functions, and we were able to handle it. The get did not change. We got the user in our get and we handled it. So this is why it's very powerful. You can change your definitions of the strategy and where the user is getting authenticated the first time. So depending upon that, implementation might be slightly different, but that is all that you need to do. The rest of your application can just work on this. So all your gets, all your other parts of it, which are using the authentication, which are not authenticating the user, but using that authentication, can just work on it. Similarly, in our strategy, admin and strategy, all here, we don't need to know the username, password, nothing. We just use the authentication that post had generated. In local, we were not doing it because post was not generating an authentication which we were using. In the case of cookie and in the case of JWT, the authentication was done by the post. So this is where typically you get a single form with the login password or the Google sign in or the Facebook sign in. And once those credentials have been created, we are using them everywhere, as we saw in the cookie and the passport JWT. So try this out. I would even suggest try out one or two different authentication strategies like Google or Facebook. They would help you immensely in making things clearer, and use exactly the code structures that we have used here.